Welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. Today, I'm joined by Russ. Russ has a podcast, Talking Tradesman podcast. He's also worked in the trades, in the construction sector for most of his life. In fact, he runs his own business, family business. But he's also had his share of mental health challenges, and that's really what prompted him to start the podcast. So, welcome, Russ. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Philip. I appreciate you inviting me onto your platform, so thank you.
Good. Well, let's start. Let's hand over to you. Perhaps you want to talk about your early life and your family business, how you got into the sector, and then maybe what made you think that you were starting to suffer from some kind of mental health issues.
Yeah, sure. So, early life. So I'm, to paint the scene, as it were, I'm a third generation painter and decorator. I've been running my business for 24 years now. I took over the business at 17. My grandfather started the business back in the 60s. So I have pretty much spent my whole life in construction and in and around. I've done a few different roles, but I've always been around construction and been around people that are in construction. In terms of my early life, I guess a very sort of brief snapshot of it, really. I had what I would refer to as a normal childhood up until the age of 8. At 8 years old, my mother and father split. And I guess the one thing that was a little bit atypical there was that it was actually my mother that left the house rather than my father. And I was raised by my dad from the age of 8 years old. So my mum left at that stage. She wouldn't mind me saying she had an affair and left the family house, as it were. And my father was a drinker. So that was my childhood. I now know later on down the line that the impact that had on me in terms of my development, in terms of like the childhood traumas that I experienced growing up. And, I've got to say there was no one horrendous moment, but there was probably a cumulative sort of neglect, I guess, and abandonment. It's certainly what's transpired throughout the later years. That set the scene. I mean, one of the reasons I took over my business at such a young age, at 17, was I had a huge fallout with my father, related to his drinking, and then we didn't speak for 8 years. So I took the business on from that point, picked it up and made it mine.
Did you know, it's difficult when you're a child, isn't it, to know what's normal or what isn't? Were you aware when you were young that perhaps the experience you were having wasn't like most of your mates were having? It's difficult to see it objectively, but were you aware at the time that it wasn't a kind of the childhood perhaps you wanted?
No, I wasn't. I think looking back, my school, so I was in a normal education system. I certainly wasn't privately educated. I was at state schools, and I think, looking back, the course that I took throughout school, I was surrounded by people that were in similar positions. I went to school in what was referred to as a rough area. And I guess, to be honest with you, a lot of people that were at that school had various problems, and their family life wasn't the typical Brady Bunch family. So if I'm honest with you, Philip, possibly looking at my childhood, because of the circle that I was surrounded with, not only did it feel normal, but I possibly had a better childhood than some of the people, some of my peer group. So no, it didn't feel abnormal. It didn't feel wrong. And when I was a kid, I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand, for example, that it wasn't normal to come home from school at like 8, 9 years old and have to make your own dinner because my dad was going to finish work, go straight to the pub and not come home until 8, 9 o'clock at night drunk. That it didn't cross my mind that wasn't a typical childhood, and for a large part of it, as a kid, I was happy, because I had a huge amount of freedom that a lot of my friends didn't. Although I had to look after myself and grow up very quickly. The one thing I will say is that my dad was never abusive, never violent. The only thing I could say was that he wasn't there. So yeah, I had to raise myself a lot, and with that came a lot of freedom. When I was football obsessed, so I'd pretty much come home from school and play football till it got dark, and that was my childhood, really.
So you were 17, you took over your dad's business. I mean, that's quite young to take on that sort of responsibility. So how did things go then?
Really well, if I'm honest. It gave me, I've always been a little bit different. So I took after, I guess, my grandfather a bit more. My grandfather was the one that set the business up. He was a lot more driven, had a lot more business minded. And I fell into that line. I had aspirations for the business. My father, because of his personal circumstances, was more to the point of just wanted to turn up and work. He didn't want to grow the business, didn't want to expand it. So we were in conflict quite early. I mean, the reason that I started working in the industry was because my mum and dad, when they split at 8 years old, my dad, he worked full time. So when it came to summer holidays, Christmas, Easter holidays, my options were I go to work with him. There was no, I can stay at home because I was too young. So I used to go to work with him. And then my option was I could either sit and read a magazine, or he'd pay me, £5 a day, £10 a day to do some work, whether it was stripping wallpaper to begin with or doing the menial tasks, the preparation, the sanding. And I would always choose that. So I'd be like, oh yeah, great. I can do this for a week and I've got 25 quid. And to me at my age, that was a fortune. I could buy all the FIFA stickers I wanted at the end of the week with that. So I made that choice, and that was my inroad into the trade. That progressed. And by the time I was 15, I was running jobs for him. My dad would obviously knock off work quite early because of where he wanted to be, and it wasn't at work. So I would run jobs on his behalf, almost like contract manager. So strangely, by the time I got to 17, I'd actually got quite a lot of experience behind me. And when I took the business on at 17, my biggest concern was, if I'm honest, I'm too young, people won't employ me. I was fortunate that I had my grandfather who was still in business but retiring. So I kind of came up as he went down, and there was a bit of an exchange. So he passed me on to his customers. He would work with me and almost be the face of the business initially, although fully letting me have the reins and run everything. And I've grown the business into what it is now. So currently, we specialise in high-end domestic. I've worked in every demographic of the painting and decorating industry there is. I've done private, commercial, large, small. And at the moment, we've settled in high-end domestic. So the trades have always been good to me financially. I've never been out of work, not once in 24 years. Have I ever had any downtime where I've had no work? I worked through the last recession, which was, well, I guess you could argue the last recession was a few years ago, actually, but the one before that, which was 2008, I think. I was in business through that and never, didn't drop a beat. So the trade has always been good to me. One of the things my granddad said to me as a child was, get yourself a trade behind you. You'll never be out of work. And that has proved true.
So things are going well then. You took over the business, things are going well, as you just said. So what happened next?
Well, I mean, my business life has been relatively straightforward, I think, in and out, ups and downs, trying different things. What I would say is my business life, because I progressed very quickly, that also played out in my personal life. So by the age of 21, I met who would go on to be my ex-wife, got married at 22, had my son at 23, and bought my own house at 24, I think. So everything went very quick. I felt very mature. I felt like I was a man. I felt like I knew exactly what I was doing. In reality, I didn't. But I think the responsibility I'd taken on from such a young age, like I say, it also played out into my personal life. Now, I know the subject of the conversation being around mental health. That relationship played out how a lot of relationships play out at that age. We got together at 21. We grew apart. I had 2 children with my ex-wife. I won't go into details of the relationship and the breakdown because, there's other people involved. And I wouldn't, it'd be unfair to do so. But what I can say is talk about things from my point of view. And that was, so at 30 years old, that relationship broke down, completely broke. And I would say that was the beginning of my personal mental health journey. Up until then, I was your typical lad culture. You know, to me, like I said, I loved football. I played football from the age of 8 till the age of 30, Sunday league and all the rest of it. Typical lad culture. I worked hard all week and I lived for the weekends. So the weekends were going out, clubbing, drinking, partying. And as I say, at the point where my relationship broke down, it wasn't anything to do with that. But up until then, I was completely naive and ignorant around mental health. I would have been the person that if you'd have asked me, how's your mental health? I'd have turned around and said, I haven't got it, mate. I was completely ignorant around it. So during the course of that breakdown, the main sort of pressure point and issue there was I've got two children with my ex-wife. My ex-wife is from a different part of the country to me, although we spent the entirety of our relationship in the Midlands. 3 days after we split up, she moved or made the decision to move to Devon. So I had a 2-year period where I was involved in court cases and battles in terms of, and I must say, she never tried to stop me seeing the kids, but it was extremely difficult to do so. Let's just say that. So there was a whole court case system that played out over the course of 2 years. And that was the first time where I was ever forced to or ever experienced, to my knowledge at that point, mental health. And what I would say, openly, so during that period, I started to suffer with anxiety and a couple of borderline panic attacks revolving around the court cases and court hearings and just anxiety in general, to the point, my phone would go off and my heart would go through the roof and my heart rate would go up, and the anxiety over, oh God, what's this message going to be? What, solicitors and the cost. On paper, if I'm honest with you, Philip, at that point in my life, I'd achieved a hell of a lot. I was 30 years old. I'd bought my house, nice car, family. The 2.4 children image that we're all given as the image of success. The breakdown of that relationship took all of that away. The house was sold. I could turn around and say I lost everything. I lost my house, I lost my car, I lost my kids in the breakdown of that relationship. So, as I say, that was the first time where I ever became aware that my mental health had deteriorated.
Did that happen? Was that kind of a daily thing? Did you see that creep up? Was it changing your personality? I know you said you started to suffer from anxiety. Did it become overwhelming?
It did, but I didn't realise it. I know that this sounds a bit strange, but when you're not aware, and I was completely unaware that I had mental health, I didn't realise it was a thing. So I wasn't able to step back and examine it. So I was just getting on with it. And it manifested itself in, I started drinking more. My skin got bad. My temper got short, probably became more aggressive. So yeah, it definitely manifested itself, but I wasn't aware of it. I just thought, I'm a bit stressed, was probably the depth of that. I would say that the first time I was forced to pay attention, so about a year after I split up with my ex-wife, I met who is now my wife. So I got into a new relationship, as you do. And she pointed out to me on a few occasions there would be certain pinch points, whether it would be the outcome of a court hearing or a telephone call from the solicitor that was bad news. She pointed out to me that she would sort of say, well, how are you feeling? And my go-to response would be, absolutely fine. Yeah, I'm fine. Not bothered. Fine. She pointed out to me that, look, it looks to me like you're suffering with a bit of anxiety. And I'm like, no, of course I'm not. But then I would sort of turn around and say, I'd have a phone call, and the result of a phone call, I'd have a bad stomach, I'd have a splitting headache, I'd, flush red, high heart rate, and all these things. It was building and building and building because I was not addressing it whatsoever. I'm not sure if there was a particular light bulb moment, where I really sort of zoned in and started to tune into mental health. It was more of a slow dawning realization from what my partner was telling me actually made sense.
But you wouldn't know, would you? Unless somebody had told you, or you'd been educated somehow, or you wouldn't know that those feelings that you had, and the fact you were drinking more, or, you were having physiological reactions was actually down to mental health. Unless you knew that, why would you know it? And I'm sure there's people listening to this thinking, well, I just get quite angry about things, but I haven't got any mental health problems. And it's bridging that gap, isn't it? And why would you know? Why would you know?
And looking back, my wife now was probably the first person with any kind of knowledge around mental health or experience of it. My social circle, my friend circle, my family, nobody ever talked about mental health. We didn't even talk about our feelings. So my father was from the generation where the man up generation, as it were, strong, strength is silence. And working in the construction industry my whole life, very, very similar. So I never had those conversations with anyone. I don't think I ever spoke about my emotions with anyone other than being angry. That was okay. Being angry is acceptable. Being upset, sad, down, we don't talk about that, And as I say, I got to a point where I was forced to acknowledge that I was struggling. And it was very obvious as to why, fortunately for me, people around me were sort of saying, well, you're dealing with all this. How are you still okay? One of my best friends, I remember the conversation when he actually said to me, he was like, how are you still okay? You've had to sell the house. You've had to do this. You've had to do that. You're up and down the country to see your kids every weekend. And my response at the time was, I just am. The truth was I wasn't. I was broken. I was crumbling. I was barely hanging on. But I wasn't aware that there was any other way to be. So you can't address something. It's like, I don't know, if you never looked in a mirror your whole life, would you know that you had a nose? I never knew that mental health was a thing. And that sounds really naive now, given everything that I've done over the last 10 years. But in reality, I think there was probably a degree of protection through the ignorance, if I'm honest.
Do you think it was anything to do with pride, or, not wanting to appear to be vulnerable, or, maybe something to do with not being perceived to be masculine, or, but all those things which are still common? And I'm assuming from what you're saying, you didn't share your concerns you didn't open up and tell anyone, or maybe not even your partner, actually. You just kind of denied it.
There was definitely a part of that, mate. And that was due to my upbringing and the surrounding that I had. As I said to you before, strength was silence. I came from a family upbringing where my father didn't speak, so he would not address his emotions. My grandfather, who was an amazing person, would also not speak or not address his emotions. You'd talk about an emotional situation with him and he would sort of just go, well, enough about that anyway, I'll put the kettle on. Those things were not addressed. It was just not seen as a manly thing to do. So you do what you do. You do what every child does. You imitate. So I would imitate them because they were the alpha example in my life. And until you're shown any different kind of way, then that's the only way. And that was the way that I operated. I think I probably have always been surrounded by quite a macho culture. As I say, I was always I used to play football. I used to play rugby. I've been in the building trades all my life. I actually worked as a bailiff for 4 years. So I've always been in very male dominant alpha male industries where, as I said, strength is shown physically, not emotionally.
How much of that still goes on, do you think? We're living in a time where awareness is changing, but actually are things really changing? Whilst men may be more aware of mental health, does that help in terms of trying to address their own or even admit it to themselves, let alone other people?
No, I've got a few opinions on this, really, Philip. It's awareness is changing, but there's awareness and change are two very different things. And mental health, unfortunately, there's a lot of flag waving around mental health. There's a lot of, on an individual and on a larger scale, like a corporate scale, there's a lot of companies out there that will talk about their mental health programs in the workplace, but what are they actually doing? Booking in one mental health talk a year to tick that box to say that they're mental health aware. It's not really doing anything. It's not really addressing anything. And the root cause of a lot of mental health is way down the line. And it's such a long process to try and better yourself or help people. And I think the reality is, do people really want to invest in helping people with their mental health, or do they just want to be seen to be helping people? And you're quite aware, I think we're probably living in a day and age at the moment where mental health is probably talked about more than it ever has been in the history of modern society. Yet we're faced with suicide rates that are higher than ever. Particularly in my industry, in construction, it's absolutely horrendous. I work in the worst industry by demographic for male suicide. We're 4 times more likely, if you work in construction, to take your own life than the average male. There's an average of, I think it's like 2.2 men a day in construction are taking their own life. That's 10 families every week that are getting that phone call or that knock at the door, and the ripple, the butterfly effect from every person that takes their own life, that will then affect everybody that knew them. It will affect their friends, it will affect their family, it will affect children and anybody that has been in that person's proximity. So, like I say, when you look at it like that, 1 is too many, but 10 and 10 per week it's frightening. And it's a statistic and a trajectory that is on the up, not on the decline. It's at its highest point. I think the ONS statistics were released recently, and male suicide figures are at their highest since 1999. Male suicide figures are a lot higher than female suicide figures. However, just to point out, female suicide figures are at their highest since 1993. So they're both on the up. It's not just a problem affecting men. And to me, it's baffling that this isn't like a conversation. Things are clearly at crisis, particularly in my industry. And it's not a conversation that people are having. And the thing that I've said a few times is that suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. If that was, in my mind, if that was anything else, like you imagine if fishing was the biggest killer of men under 50, I believe there would be government legislation, you'd have to hold a license, you'd have to be trained, you'd have to wear PPE, safety equipment and everything to address that. But because it's people taking their own life, there's nothing being done.
Why is it, Russ? Why do you think it's so high in the construction trade?
So during my podcast, I have spoken to over 50 guests now. And when I remember, I try to ask them all that exact question. What do you feel that construction is so adversely affected? And there are certain answers that come up on repeat. Pressure being a big one. It's an industry that is highly dominated by the self-employed. So like me, myself, I'm a business owner. I've got no HR department. I've got nobody tapping me on the shoulder on Friday saying, Russ, you've worked 90 hours this week, mate. Calm down, or are you okay? Go and speak to HR or occupational health. We've got none of that. We're self-governed, as it were. Isolation is a big one. A lot of the trades. So within construction, the 2 worst affected trades are painters and decorators, funnily enough, and plasterers. And they are the 2 finishing trades. So the 2 most likely to work alone. There's money troubles, finances is always a big thing. And one that I don't want to gloss over is that the culture within construction is very much work hard, play hard. There's a lot of addiction issues with people that work in construction. And again, what I find is it's rarely one thing. It's rarely one factor. It's rarely that people work alone too much that would cause them to go and take their own life. But it would be the combination. So life throws combinations at you. It would be the combination of potentially the culture. So the work hard, play hard, the drinking and drugs, which lead to a relationship breakdown. And then surrounding that, you've got somebody that might work alone a lot of the time. So they're trapped in their own thoughts, and they may be experiencing financial difficulties because they're not working to the best of their abilities anymore because of everything else that's going on. And it's this perfect tornado of trauma that some people don't see a way out of, unfortunately. So I think there's a lot of factors within construction. I wouldn't pluck out one thing. I think it's a combination.
So going back to your mental health experiences. So, you mentioned that you were suffering a lot of anxiety when you were having problems with your divorce. What happened then? Because I know that you have since trained to help people in a similar situation. What kind of triggered that for you, that you wanted to kind of help others? How did you help yourself first, really? How did you help yourself?
To be honest with you, it's been a 10-year journey. So that was 10 years ago, was the relationship breakdown. Once I had recognised, or had pointed out to me, once I had pointed out to me, and I was ready to accept that I had and was struggling with mental health, the way that I addressed that was I became fascinated, essentially, with the physical manifestations of the brain, the thought system. So the fact that, and everyone knows, if I were to say to you, high stress can cause a heart attack, nobody would argue that. Everyone knows that. So stress can cause illness. Stress can cause, as I say, digestive problems, bad skin. The list goes on. Struggle sleeping, physical symptoms, physical manifestations of your thought patterns. And when I started to zone in on that, I became fascinated by it, because I also found that with anything in that sort of perspective comes balance. So if the negative is true, then so is the positive. If your negative thoughts can cause all these negative impacts to your body, then surely positive must do the same. I started studying psychology informally. So reading books on mindset and psychology and the mind. Books like The Body Holds the Score. Don't know if you've ever read that one. But I went down a huge rabbit hole, if I'm honest, Philip. So I initially studied psychology to address my symptoms as they were at that point in time. I then started looking into childhood trauma and then unpicking my own childhood and some of the things that I've been dealing with and my behaviour patterns as a result of things that happened to me in my life as a child. And I did that informally at first, and that was reading books, listening to audiobooks, listening to podcasts, and then decided that I'd got a real passion for it and I should do something formal. So I enrolled on and started studying a BSc honours degree in psychology with the intention of using that qualification to go into counselling or therapy and potentially sort of help people that had been through similar situations. During the course of doing that, because I was doing that part-time with the OU, because I've always been running my business, I decided, so you've got three directions with psychology, essentially. You can go into sports psychology, child psychology, or counselling and therapy. So I went counselling and therapy, as I previously mentioned. In order to immerse myself in that, I decided I needed to get some experience, because if I'm honest, there was a concern that if I started giving therapy or counselling, would I take that home, or would I be able to leave it at the doorstep, kind of thing? So I applied to and started volunteering at Samaritans, at my local branch of Samaritans. So I did the training for Samaritans and volunteered for them for over 18 months. As it happens, with everything I've now got going on, I've actually hit pause on the volunteering because I'm just struggling with time. But it was a fantastic experience, not only with the training, but learning to listen, and getting involved in that whole cycle of counselling. And although Samaritans are only a listening service, they're not there to counsel, it's very much in speaking to people that are in crisis and seeing how I would react to that. From there, it's a bit of a long story, but from there, with this experience, so at this point in time, I was studying psychology and volunteering at Samaritans, happened to have a conversation with my wife where I said, I had recognised that there was a particular problem in my industry, in construction, and what could I do that would directly target that industry and take a bit more direct action. And it was an off-the-cuff comment that I said to her one day where I said, maybe I could do a podcast. She picked that up and ran with it, if I'm honest. She turned round and went and looked at an office space and signed a tenancy without consulting me, and then told me I'd got to do the refurb for it. So we took on a tenancy on a small office to turn into a small recording studio for a podcast that I had no idea if it was going to work. And my podcast, The Talking Tradesman, was born from there.
So where do you see yourself now? Because you know, it's going back a few years, but you obviously had the very anxious time when you were going through your divorce. But since then, and going through what you've done yourself, which is continue with your business, but also trained to be a counsellor with Samaritans and through studying. How has that affected your mental health, now?
To refer back to the comment, education, really, I am so much more educated. And I think, if I'm honest, me as a person, it's made me a better husband. It's made me a better father, and probably a better friend, and even a better business owner. Just being aware, because previously I was so unaware of my mental health and therefore my triggers because of various traumas that I'd experienced, that I would be a lot more reactive. Examples of that, for example, because of my mother leaving the house when I was young, I've sort of took on, I guess, female abandonment issues, as it were. So that then played out into my first relationship when I was very unaware of it. And I would see controlling behavior as love because I was desperate for that. I've always got this underlying fear that a female in my life is going to leave. So I would sort of look for signs that wasn't going to happen, even if they were signs that weren't healthy. And it's having that kind of education now where I will evaluate my own thought patterns. I'll evaluate my reactions before I react. I'm nowhere near as reactive as I used to be. In fact, I'm extremely chilled out now, to the point I find it really difficult to get angry with people now, Philip, because somebody will act out in a way where I would previously have reacted. I would, deal with aggression. Whereas now, if I were to deal with, say, one of the lads on site who comes in and aggressive and snappy or answers back to something that's said, I'll look now and think, I wonder what's happened. Like, what's going on? What have you got going on? What's made you react like that? Whereas before I wouldn't have had that consciousness to think that way. So I think personally, it sounds really cheesy, doesn't it? But in order to be the best version of yourself, you need to be aware of yourself. You need to be aware of what makes you tick, what ingredients have gone into the mixing bowl that have created you, because there's a lot of things, I guess, throughout my life which wouldn't be stereotypically perfect or even advisable or wanted if you were to pick it from the outside in. But I wouldn't change any of it, because everything that I experienced, every hardship that I've gone through, every loss, every bereavement, whatever it might be, it's made me who I am today. It's all been experience that has led to this. I wouldn't be sat here now, I wouldn't be doing this if I'd had the perfect upbringing. So seeing, it's another big thing really, seeing the value in trauma. That, I think, is a perspective changer, a mindset changer. If you can take a traumatic event that has happened and turn it into seeing value in it rather than being victim to it, that's such a powerful thing.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. So if anyone's listening to this who maybe they work in the construction sector and they're struggling, or maybe it's someone listening to this who knows, they've got a loved one or a friend, colleague, who they want to be able to help, but they don't know how. And maybe they're just seeing, consequences of mental ill health. So maybe they're seeing, overly aggressive behavior or drinking drugs, whatever it might be. what can they do? What's a kind of basic step that anyone can do to start trying to help themselves or help other people?
In my opinion, it's just having that initial conversation, Philip. My podcast, The Talking Tradesman, refers to me. So I am a tradesman, and I'm the one out there trying to get people talking. And I'm quite keen to sort of say that, look, the podcast is not just for people in construction. I've spoken to a lot of people that are not in construction, because construction in the UK is such a big industry. I would think that there's not many people that don't know somebody, whether it's a friend, a family member, a partner, a brother, a sister, that works in the industry. So by learning how difficult it can be and what the stumbling blocks are for that industry, we can all help each other. Just the awareness, having that awareness to just keep an eye out for people when they might be struggling, because it is a particularly hard industry. I think that's really beneficial. So in terms of a first step, talking, the podcast, my logo literally says The Talking Tradesman, let's talk. And that is the first step. It's let's talk. And the one thing I think overarchingly that I've experienced through doing the podcast, because when I started it, I sort of was a big advocate for saying, look, we need to get men talking. Like, men don't talk, so let's get men talking. What I've experienced through doing this is that actually men do want to talk. The main issue is that not having anyone to listen. So a really powerful, valuable thing is to provide a safe space to listen. And that if you know somebody's struggling, is just be there to listen. And I think it's something that isn't spoken about enough, because a lot of people push, let's talk about it. But do you know how to listen to that person? If they decide to trust you and open up and talk, do you know how to listen? Are you going to sit there and just try and take their problem and give them a solution? Or can you sit in that space with them and just listen? And that skill, and that's something that I learned at Samaritans, is invaluable, and is the difference between whether people will talk or not. Just listening to somebody, it sounds like the most simple thing in the world, but it really isn't, because it's our nature. If somebody comes to you with a problem, I've had a really bad day, this has happened, to go, oh, well, try this, do this, say this, go there. That isn't what's needed. A lot of the time, people just want to be heard. And in particular, men want to be heard. We do want to be heard. We do want somebody to listen, but we're fearful that information can be taken and used against you, or that you'll be seen in a detrimental way by the person that you're talking to. So there's a couple of things there, isn't there? But one is having the initial conversation. If you're struggling, is don't hold it in, don't bottle it up. Talk to somebody, just let somebody know that you're struggling. And two, for people that aren't struggling, is be a safe space to listen. Be aware of those around you and take some responsibility to be there to listen. And I'll just caveat everything I've said there with, if you are struggling and you're looking around you and thinking nobody is there to listen to me, there are organisations out there like Samaritans who you can call 24 hours a day, 365 days a year on 116123. And there's always somebody that will listen. And sometimes as a man, and as a man in something like construction, and you're worried about, are people going to look down on you if you confide, and they think you're weak, whatever that might be? An anonymous service like Samaritans, where nobody knows who you are, your number's withheld, it comes up, you haven't got a location. That's actually appealing, because you can be completely honest with a stranger and not fear judgment, because they don't know you to judge you.
That's brilliant advice. Thank you, Russ. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been brilliant. Your advice has been fantastic, and thank you for being really open as well, open and honest, because I think that's what works. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Philip.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you can relate to any of the issues Russ discussed in this episode, or if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, there are organisations you can call. For example, in the UK, the Samaritans on 116123. And if you're in the US, you can call 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you want to listen to Russ's podcast, it's called The Talking Tradesman. If you have a story to tell and you think your experience would help others, then please do get in touch, either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Finally, please share the podcast with people you know and with your networks. And if you enjoyed listening, then please rate and review it and help raise its profile so that we can reach more people who might benefit from the stories shared by my guests.